It's very exciting. So today I'm going to talk more about categorization, which is obviously a very important topic in computational neuroscience. And here I'm going, because this is eventually what the neurons do, I guess, is the connection I'm trying to make. Though it isn't really as connected to the low-level stuff as most of the other talks we'll see. So today I'm going to talk about attention to dimensions in categorization. So this is sort of building on the work that Daphne talked, where you're coming up with a sort of similarity function for the entire space. But this is talking about how people might have different similarity functions in different situations. Okay, so generalization is, of course, very important if you want to act in the world. So you have all sorts of stimuli in the environment, some that have different properties, and you need to know what these properties are and why they're important. And despite the fact that some things may be very similar perceptually, they may have very different properties, like these things are better to eat than those things. So you want to group these things differently than those things. And sort of categorization helps you do this generalization problem. They're a little better than bugs. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a lot of data from the cognitive science literature and how this has caused me to try to build a hierarchical model of categorization and how we can understand how people group things in this way. So I'll talk about generalization from single examples, which has been an area of study. Moving on to multiple examples, how we can flexibly generalize depending on how the examples relate to each other. What sort of biases we might have when we're generalizing from multiple examples, and how these biases might arise from the sort of categories we've seen before, sort of like this ability to learn from the variability in one category and apply it to a new category. And then talking about how we can embody this in a hierarchical Bayesian model, and finally talk about some predictions about feature switching, and at least a preliminary experiment I've run trying to show how quickly people can move between different sort of modes of categorizing. Okay, so in generalizing from a single example, if you look at the way that people will give similarity ratings, so if you give them this set of stimuli and you give them in pairs and ask them how similar are each of these pairs to each other, they can give ratings. And then if you look at the distance measures that they give you, then with this sort of stimuli where you have such as hue and saturation, though I'm not quite sure which one's which, they give you a Euclidean distance metric. And this is kind of the point. You're not quite sure how the dimensions match onto these things, or at least I'm not. And people who are artists, they can tell that one is hue and one is saturation, and they tend to not have the same sort of similarity function here. But there are some dimensions which are called integral dimensions in cognitive science, where all that matters is basically the similarity of the parameters, the Euclidean distance that they have from each other. And then there's other sets of dimensions known as separable dimensions, where the feature match matters quite a lot. So if you have something like the size and brightness of these sets of boxes right here, I collected some similarity data where I gave people all the pairs and then asked them how similar are they to each other. And if they match on one dimension, if they match on size, or if they match on brightness, then people will say that they're very similar. But as soon as you move off axis a little bit, then people are very unwilling to say that they're similar. They have these very strong biases towards saying that things are similar when they match in features, but not if they don't. So the dimensions are not just reasonably important. If you're trying to construct a similarity space, they can be so important that they're kind of annoying. So one study that Tversky and Gotti did in 1982, they tried to see whether you could construct a similarity space that satisfied the metric axioms. And one of the metric axioms is the triangle inequality, basically saying that you can't take a shortcut by going around a corner. You have to go straight in order to satisfy this axiom. And what they did to test whether people were doing this is they constructed this task called the corner inequality. So a problem with collecting similarity judgments is that the numbers that they give out are not necessarily a completely monotonic reflection of, a completely linear reflection of the numbers they have in their head. So you want to just be able to test the ordinal relationships that they produce. So here they looked at the similarity of these two stimuli, the similarity of those stimuli, and so on. And they find out that the dissimilarity, the distance here, is greater than the distance here, and the distance here is greater than the distance here. So basically you have this sort of violation, where if you go around the corner, you actually have less some similarity than if you go along the straight line. And then, of course, there's a question here about whether people are actually doing this within a two-dimensional space. So if it's a three-dimensional space, you can imagine this thing's lying on a bump. And if it's on a bump, then you could get this sort of violation of the triangle inequality just by having the wrong sort of dimensionality in your representation. So they tried to test this by looking at different scaling solutions, and they found out that doing multidimensional scaling with a third dimension really didn't add very much. This was their at least evidence that there was basically two dimensions. Okay, so modeling similarity ratings, the classic way to do so in cognitive science is to use a Minkowski power metric. So you can have different exponents here that tell you what sort of shape of generalization you have. So each of these lines is equally good at going out from this central stimulus here. So you have Euclidean similarity, which is a metric of 1, and you have, for instance, in order to get something like this violation of the triangle inequality, you need to get an exponent that's below 1, and you get something like this star-shaped metric right here. And sorry, the Euclidean similarity is the 2. Okay, so generalizing from a single example, you can explain it with this Minkowski power metric with these different exponents. But if you're generalizing from different examples, you get different types of behavior. So the question is, how should we cluster within a category? So if we see a lot of examples, how should we represent a whole bunch of stimuli? So instead of, we can look at how we should build up a sort of model of the stimuli that have been presented. Now, one way to do this is just saying that you have a prototype for a particular category. You represent it by the mean, for instance, and then say you have some sort of variability around this. And the nice thing about a prototype is it gives you, you don't have to spend a lot of memory to represent it. You can just use a mean value and some sort of variance in order to explain your category. But it doesn't have a lot of flexibility. You have a single mode distribution. Another way to do it, which is sort of the opposite and was argued a lot in psychology, is saying that people have exemplar models. So saying that you represent each and every stimulus that you've ever seen, and you basically put a bump where each stimulus is. And this gives you a nice multimodal distribution, which is very flexible, but on the other hand, you have high memory requirements. You have to remember every example that you've seen before. So there's been a lot of tests of this, and one of the, I think, most visually appealing tests was to give people two categories of this form. So they, Nosofsky in 1995 with McKinley, gave people these sort of windshield wiper stimuli. So you have the stimuli that can vary in the size of the semicircle and the angle of the windshield wiper. And in these two-dimensional stimuli, they constructed two categories. And these categories each consisted of different sets of clusters. So you had these 4 clusters for category A, and then these 2 Gaussian clusters for category B. And if you were to look at the optimal line for dividing these 2 clusters into category A and B, it's these curved, it gives you this sort of like cross-shaped category for category B. This is the optimal decisions. You say B in this area, A in all these areas. Okay, so when you test subjects, this is actually a very hard sort of category structure to learn, and that's because it's probabilistic. So the way that they produced the stimuli is that they selected one of these 2 groups, they selected one of the clusters, and then they generated an example. And you're right if you guess the right generating example. However, an example here near the boundary could be A or B, depending on which trial it is, whichever one generated it. So people are very unhappy with probabilistic categories, and it takes them a very long time to learn this. In this task, they ran 4,000 trials of training. So in each trial, you chose stimulus, say, is this A or B, and people would respond. And based on their responses on the final 300 trials, you can see that they actually, 3 of 11 participants are actually able to learn this very non-prototypical category structure. So they have some X's over here saying that these are A's. And then they have all sorts of circles along the cross showing that they managed to learn the B's.
You tell them the answer?
Sorry?
They told them the answer.
They're trained.
Supervised.
Well, you don't show them the structure at all, but it is supervised in that after each example you make a guess, and then you're given feedback whether you're correct or not.
And what we see here is after training test.
This is after 4,000 trials of training, or about 3,700 trials of training. Well, it's still training in a way. So this is just the final trials in the block. Yeah.
I don't understand what these circles are. So do they see examples outside the circles?
Oh yeah,
outside.
these are just equal probability curves, so they spread out
okay.
everywhere. Yeah.
But you don't see. Okay, but you don't see. They don't sample beyond. They don't sample entirely. It's not sampled uniformly in this plane.
No. So they're sampling from the actual categories when they present. So these are.
What are the actual
Oh yeah. So these are Gaussian distributions right here. This centered at this point, this point, this point, and this point, and they're all labeled A when you sample from them. And then these are Gaussian distributions as well that are labeled B. Okay.
So you choose the category randomly, and then choose a place according to the Gaussian distribution.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so we have those. We know at least that they don't have just a prototype representation. But on the other hand, the exemplar representation is not too appealing because you have these huge memory requirements. It's hard to say that people would actually remember all 4,000 trials.
So do the other 8 participants have a prototype, a unimodal prototype representation?
I think it sort of broke down into about thirds. So there were some that had sort of a prototypical one, and I think others had, you could divide it into like 3 sections, which I guess that would be difficult to describe with a prototype. Okay, so instead of trying to describe it with one of these 2 extremes, a prototype or an exemplar, we could try to go for something in between, which is to look at a multi-prototype model in a way. So a nice way to do this is to use a Bayesian non-parametric prior. So we can say that we have an unknown number of clusters, and we want to figure out the number of clusters based on the data that we see. And the Dirichlet process mixture model is one way to do this. Basically, it's a non-parametric prior where the rich get richer. So as your cluster has more and more items in it, then it's more probable later on. But there's always some probability of assigning it to a new cluster if the similarity is low enough. Okay, so I've talked about flexibility of generalizing from multiple examples. You can have these different types of representations. And now I'm finally going to talk about what sort of biases we have when we generalize from multiple examples. So there was this classic study in cognitive psychology where you train these different types of category structures. So these are 3-dimensional binary stimuli. And if you look at all the ways to split these 8 stimuli into 2 groups of 4, there's 6 useful ways of doing so. So you have things that seem reasonably easy, like these type 1 categories, where if you just know that it belongs to, there's one feature that distinguishes the 2 groups from each other. And then it can get harder, where you have 2 features that do so, all the way up to this type 6 category, where there's nothing next to each other, which would be the hardest one to learn. And what they were interested in doing is initially collecting identification performance. So they'd show people 2 stimuli and say, which one is this one? And then they saw how accurate they were in identifying these different stimuli compared to a different stimulus. And based on identification performance, people were just learning categories, and the category performance depended on how close these things were in the space. Then you would say that this identification performance that they have initially should predict their categorization performance later on. But when you look at the errors that they make, the errors that they make seem to depend more on dimensions. So here, with this type 1 category, this is easy to learn, and the errors that you would expect from the identification initial trials are reasonably low, so that's fine. But the problem is type 2 right here is actually reasonably hard if you just look at the identification errors that they make. But if you look at their classification errors, once they've been trained on these 2 different categories, they can distinguish them very, very well. So there's this sort of transition that they make through the categorization task that allows them to take this initial poor identification performance and somehow change the space so that it's easier. And the way that they're assumed to change the space is basically stretching or shrinking it along particular dimensions. So you can say, look at size, for instance, and say size is very important. And by doing so, what you're doing is you're taking sort of your mental similarity space and stretching it along the size dimension so that discriminations are easier. And the sort of standard model of categorization takes this into account. So there is a weight parameter for each dimension. And these weight parameters can be learned through something like backpropagation. So as you make errors in your task, you learn which dimensions are important. And then you weight your new stimulus against all the old stimuli using this weight vector to tell you which dimensions are important for making the judgment. Okay, so the sort of weights that you have are not infinitely flexible. You have these particular dimensions. These are the things that you pay attention to. So you can look at this task called filtration or condensation, where you can either have two categories that are distinguished along a dimension, or categories that are distinguished along some sort of combination of dimensions. Dimensions such as height or position of, I forget actually what the stimulus was here. So if you're able to stretch or shrink the space along particular dimensions, you can make the filtration task easier, but you can't make the condensation task easier. And so they show that as you go through epochs of training, that you're able to learn the filtration task much more quickly and accurately than you're able to learn the condensation task. Filtration is that you can make a decision based on basically a threshold along a dimension.
One particular dimension.
Yep. You don't need a combination. And also what's interesting is that this basis is not innate to people. So if you look at children, this basis is learned. So what Smith in 1989 did is she presented kids and of different ages and adults with these 6 stimuli right here that belong in this color and size parameter space. And they asked them to just classify them however they'd like. They gave them 6 stimuli, say break them into groups, tell me what groups you have of these stimuli. And if you do it for kids, you get something like this overall similarity result, where the things that are really nearby in the parameter space are the ones that matter. As you get older, you start to pay more attention to dimensions, so you want things to sort of match more in dimensions. And as you become an adult, you want dimensions to match almost exactly. You're very uncomfortable with things that are just even a little bit off when you're providing these groups to the experimenter. And you get this sort of nice gradation in the subjects that showed these 3 different patterns. So as you're a 3-year-old, you do mostly overall similarity, and as you're an adult, you do mostly one-dimensional identity.
But why size?
Why size?
I'm sorry, why not size?
Why size? Well, so this is one of the reason they would do it is
an example, or this is what's happening?
that was the dimension of the stimulus size. So they had boxes of different size and different color.
Right.
Yep.
I'm saying adults always will
along one or the other. No, they weren't specific about which one they did. It's just the fact that they match. But there are sort of dominance relations. So there's there's dimensions that are more easy to use than other dimensions. So they're not all equal. Okay, so looking at this sort of Minkowski metric with weights for different dimensions, there's some drawbacks of it. The first is that you don't learn the basis. You have to know what the dimensions are, how to align your space in order to do this updating. The second is that you need separate mechanisms for similarity and categorization judgments. Your similarity judgments are based on this exponent. Your categorization judgments are based on these learned weights. So the question is, where could the basis come from? And so Samuelson and Smith, they sort of identified regularities in early word learning as a way that these features that we have could arise. So linguistically, there's basically 2 broad categories of nouns. There's count nouns, which are things you can sort of separate into individuals, like sheep, and count. And these things tend to be solid and shape constant. There are other things like mass nouns, which tend to be things like water, which you can pour out, and it's very hard to count it without a microscope. And they're very material constant. And so you have these sort of different types of regularities. So the count nouns, they're constant in shape, but the sheep don't really vary in material. But there are other things that vary in material, like cars, for instance. And other mass nouns, which can vary quite a lot in shape, but don't vary in material. And when they actually looked at the first 301 nouns that children learned and asked adults to rate these nouns how they should be organized. So they looked at things like, for organization, whether the count nouns are organized according to shape, and most of them were, whether the mass nouns were organized according to material, and most of them were. There were some variability in how the different categories are organized, but they tend to sort of fall along this lines if you ask adults to rate the nouns that children learn. And let's see, another possible explanation of this is that perhaps people are doing category packing. So there could be different regions of the space. So you have your sort of count noun region of the space, and you have your mass noun region of the space. And these have different types of variability in them. And it can be that the variability that you have varies smoothly between these different regions of the space. So you could have one, for instance, a Gaussian category that varies this way over here. For instance, for mass nouns and for count nouns, it varies differently over here. And the way that this arises is that people have seen a lot of examples of these different categories, and then they try to build up these representations so that you can basically tile the space without overlapping too much. So this is sort of a packing explanation of what's going on. Okay. So that's some of the data that we've seen in cognitive science, and some of the explanations, like this Minkowski parametric explanation, this packing explanation, and so on. And now I'm going to try to explain how we can embody this all in a hierarchical Bayesian model. So there was a rational model of categorization proposed in 1991 by John Anderson, which took this idea of a non-parametric prior for representation. So you have some unknown number of clusters for each category, and you want to infer the number of clusters using this model. And the prior that they used on the clusters, so they assumed that in continuous space you would have these Gaussian clusters, and the variance is distributed according to an independent gamma prior for each dimension. So you basically say that you can vary it in this way or you can vary it in this way, but you can't vary it. You have to know what the dimensions are, basically, in order to run this model. There's no way to learn them. More recently, Kent, Purfers, and Tenenbaum, they tried to address this solid object versus non-solid object distinction by saying that we break the space itself into different regions of variability. So we still know what the dimensions are, but instead of having to say that we have the same variability within each dimension, we can learn that, for instance, solid objects don't vary very much in shape, but vary a lot in material, while non-solid objects vary a lot in shape, but don't very much in material.
But they cover the same overlap in the region. Can I say that?
Well, they say that you sort of break the categories into two regions. So you have a different type of learning for solid objects than non-solid objects. Does that make sense?
So unlike your diagram, they actually are not in the same region, or am I mistaken?
So I guess you divide the parameter space along here. So this is some sort of stimuli in the world. These are other
separate regions.
Separate regions, yes. Okay, so what we wanted to do instead is we were interested in seeing whether people might have different latent types of variability. And it just may be that in different regions of the space, some are more likely than others. So you could say perhaps things vary a little bit in material for some objects, or vary a little bit in shape for other objects. But it depends on what category you're in. It doesn't depend really that much on the region of the space. The region of the space might determine your prior for these different types of variability. But they're both sort of present at the same time. And we also wanted to learn what the dimensions were at the same time. So we wanted to incorporate into our model the fact that you could have a different basis depending on what sort of categories you've seen in the past. So we took this rational model of categorization and we created a more hierarchical version of it in order to try to see how we might learn from natural variability and have these sort of latent different types of variability that we've learned from them. So we have these natural categories in the world, such as cars and books. Some that don't vary. Cars, for instance, are reasonably size constant, but vary a lot in color, while other things like wood vary a lot in size, but don't vary a lot in color. And if you, instead of having a gamma prior on each particular dimension, instead you can take the more general inverse Wishart prior, which allows you to have a prior over full covariance matrices. So instead of just varying a single scalar, which is your variance, you can generate full covariance matrices from this particular distribution. So at the top level, we have a inverse Wishart prior, which is parameterized by a particular mean covariance matrix. This tells you what is sort of like the biases of your inverse Wishart prior. And if you start at the top by just saying you have an identity matrix as your covariance matrix, this gives you a very unbiased starting point. So at the beginning, you don't really care what the dimensions are, which way to align the basis. And then at the mid-level, we can learn these particular covariance components. So after seeing a bunch of these categories that vary in particular ways, we can learn that some vary a lot in size, but not much in color, and the other vice versa. And we can add the components adaptively as we get more and more data. So basically, here we have this Dirichlet process mixture prior, which allows us to add different clusters to each category. And then at this mid-level, we can add different variance components as we see more and more data, and it justifies it. Okay, so if we look at this data from children where they learn basically to pay attention to features, we can imitate this by training our model on more and more categories. So if we don't see any categories, then we have this overall similarity sort of output from the model. So if we give the model these 6 items, then it will return a clustering that looks like this. However, as we present more and more categories that have this sort of relationship where they vary along one dimension or vary along another dimension, then we can get this model to really care about features. So eventually, with enough categories, it starts to look like this. It really cares about the different dimensions it sees.
But the number of clusters is given or is there?
So,
I mean, here the fact that there are 3 clusters.
Right. Yes. So that's we have like a particular parameter in the prior that tells you how likely it is you generate a new cluster based on the number of things you've seen. So I think this is reasonably, since the fact that it differs along these dimensions, there's a reasonable range of this parameter where you still get the same result.
But for the human tasks, the number of clusters is defined, or?
No. It's completely free categorization. You say just break it into groups however you like. Okay, so these sort of psychedelic graphs are to show the generalization gradients that you get from the standard model, the exemplar model, which is this Minkowski power metric. So if you have a Euclidean metric, you get the circle. If you have this metric with the exponent less than 1, you get the star shape. And how we can imitate it with what we've learned in this training with the model that we have. So our untrained model has this Euclidean metric. But when we train it with these axis-aligned categories, we get something like a star shape. And the star shape that we have, instead of being this explicit sort of changing of the space, is a superposition of the different types of variability we can get. So when you have one example, as in a similarity task, you see one example and you compare the other to it to say how similar it is. You don't know how your category varies yet. You only have one item, and it doesn't tell you whether you should vary in one way or vary in the other way. And so if you present the next item, it said, oh, okay, that's fine. Or if you present it along this dimension, you say, okay, that's fine too. So it's the unsuredness, I guess, of the second example that allows you to have this star-shaped generalization gradient. And finally, instead of being forced to have things that are aligned with a particular axis, if we trained on rotated categories, we can get the exact same thing except rotated. And also what's interesting is that we can do this dimension selection, which is the same sort of thing that happens in the task where you had the 8 stimuli break into 4 groups and the 6 different classes, if you remember that. So eventually one dimension is sort of selected as a good one to describe a category. And as soon as you have 2 items, you start to select a dimension. So here, if you were to use this Minkowski power metric, you start with the star model. And if you strongly weight the vertical dimension, then you can sort of explain why you would generalize very strongly along a particular dimension where you have 1 example or 2 examples that match up there. And the way this is done is through some sort of learning of the weights. So you learn that this gives you fewer errors if you generalize in that way as opposed to this way. And so we can imitate that because as soon as you have 2 examples, then you know how your category is likely to vary. And so you've selected this particular type of variability, and then you get this basically for free. Instead of having 2 sort of representations for it, you just have this one underlying representation where you have more or less examples. And also, the sort of generalization gradient you get depends on whether you cluster things together or not. So if you say things are part of the same cluster, then you get this strong selection with 2 examples of 1 dimension. But if you say that they're part of different clusters, then you get this, this more double star-shaped variability. You basically add these 2 types of, the superposition of 2 categories onto each other in different positions. Okay, so the model that we came up with, the biases are learned across categories. The similarity is the superposition of the possible types of generalization, and it predicts the violations of the triangle inequality without having to do something that's weird and non-metric. The new clusters are created as needed, as well as these higher level types of variability, and it predicts this particular feature selection that we have. And that's the sort of thing I'm going to investigate in the last part of my talk. So the model itself says that as soon as you get a very small number of examples, then you pick out an appropriate dimension, and that's the dimension you use for categorization. And I think that's somewhat controversial, because the other models that have done this before say that you have a very slow learning of the different dimensions. So over a long period of time, you would learn to pick out this dimension is useful for describing the categories, or this dimension is useful for describing the categories. So there's been some work with children to try to see how they change as they see 2 examples. So if you provide 1 example, you're doing a similarity task, which is what I was showing you before. But as soon as you have 2 examples, they make different sort of judgments. So here, they were curious about whether children would use perceptual features or more sort of conceptual features in order to say whether things are similar to the examples that you've seen before. So here you have a bicycle and a different bicycle, and they're perceptually very similar. So the children will choose out this perceptual match. They'll say, well, you know, despite the fact that this doesn't have the same function, these glasses, then since it has sort of these hollow circles, this is the one that goes with these 2 items up here. And actually, if you test them individually, if you give them this item by itself and say which of these 2 should go with this one, they would pick this one as well. And the same for this. However, if you give them, I believe this is actually a board with wheels on it. So if you give them this bicycle and this board with wheels on it, which has circles that are filled in, then they'll actually pick something that has the same sort of function. So this perceptual match right now, despite the fact that with this board with wheels, they'll actually pick this as closest for the single item. When you have the 2 items right here, then they'll tend to pick the skateboard, which has a similar function. So their explanation was that you move from a sort of perceptual form of processing when you have 1 example or 2 examples that match on perceptual features to a more conceptual level of processing when you have 2 things that don't quite match quite as well perceptually. And this is sort of similar to what we were talking about, where you have the different types of variability and you select one out. But it's cast at a very different level of explanation, saying that we have different types of processing, we choose one or the other. It's a much more cognitive science-y sort of explanation. So what we were interested in looking at is whether you could use different types of perceptual features just themselves and see if we could get the same sort of result. So here we were giving people different choice tasks where we gave them 2 boxes at the top and asked them which of these 4 choices down here best goes with the 2 examples at the top. And the way we structured the stimuli, or we had these 2 examples, x1 and x2, and we had 2 things that matched very well. They matched exactly on 1 dimension. So if you were to judge similarity ratings, you say this is very similar to this one, and that one's very similar to that. And then we have this other choice over here, which is not very similar to either of these 2 examples. But if you were to look at how these things vary, since these things have the same size, if you were to then say, okay, size is the interesting feature to pay attention to, then this would be the best choice. Okay, so we were also interested in how quickly people could switch back and forth. So we gave people some of these size matching, where the 2 examples matched in size trials, and some color matching trials where they matched in the color. And we tried to see whether they would pick this consistent alternative on both trials, despite the fact they were interleaved. And we also presented similarity trials after each of these choice trials to see whether they were changing the sort of features they were paying attention to as they saw. So if they quickly saw this thing that matched in size, would they then pay attention to size in the next similarity trial? Or would they be immediately reset to just saying, well, any features are good enough? Okay, so we actually found a lot of different types of behavior when we tested our 30 subjects. There were some that the majority of participants, well, I guess the plurality of participants, displayed switching behavior, where they switched between these two different types of features. While there were other subjects who paid a lot of attention to size alone. So they have this sort of dominance of a particular feature.
Check for colorblind?
I asked them if they had normal corrected vision. So it was actually lightness, so it wasn't like red-green or anything like that. That'd be a lot of colorblind subjects. Okay, so if we look at the switching subjects that we have, we can compare the similarity that they have to one of the examples. So we have these 4 choices right here. The one that matches really well, which has high similarity to this example. And then we have the others which don't match quite as well. And then we can compare that to the choices that they make when both examples are presented on the screen. And when you present the choices, you get this sort of crossover here where they move from saying that this thing is not all that similar to saying that this thing is very, very good choice to the 2 examples. And so they display this sort of crossover for both the size and the color match and for the 2 examples. And if you add the similarity of the 2 examples together, you still get the crossover to some extent. The size subjects as well displayed the ones who just paid attention to the size feature also display this crossover, but just for the size feature itself. So here when they saw 2 things that matched in size, then they were very willing to say that the consistent item, which was reasonably close in size, was a good match. But when the 2 items matched in color, they were not all that excited about it. Okay, so that's the set of the talk. So in summary, what we've done is we've created a prior that learns these category biases. It predicts this dimensional importance for similarity and categorization. You can explain the dimensional biases people have as learning across categories, that categories vary in particular ways, and they should at least initially start to cluster them in this particular way. And finally, this switching of attention, this quick switching, can be explained as trying to quickly apply your biases to a new category once you've seen 1 or 2 examples. Thank you.
So in a study like this, a very general question, you study kids and adults. Are you studying culture or are you studying cognition? Because we teach kids. I'm saying, you know, what are you studying?
Yeah, no,
teach kids how to categorize, right?
That's a very good question, right. You got to expect that there are some things that are useful across cultures. So you would see this sort of variability in categories across anything that you saw. Like cars, I guess, are not going to show up in every culture, but in a lot of cultures, they're all going to have the same properties. And I think in that way, you would get the same sort of feature learning. But assuming this model is correct, which might as well do it, right?
I'll give you.
Then it really would depend on the sort of culture that you have. So if you were dividing things up in different ways, I don't know of any examples of other cultures where they wouldn't have these particular biases, but it certainly is possible if they didn't teach them this sort of consistency relations.
Okay. So going back to the Tversky and Gotti results, would you predict therefore that you only get triangle inequality when the 2 features, that is, if you build when the corner that you build has to somehow be aligned with some feature space, that if you rotate it, the triangle inequality would come back. Is that right? Or?
Yes, yeah, and that's actually true. So if you give them like the hue and saturation, then they don't have violations of the triangle inequality. Yeah.
There's no more question. We can have lunch, and I've been instructed by the management to tell you that we're not moving the next session. So we reconvene at 2:40. Yeah, lunch is up.
Lunch will be here.